In this episode, we're going to clear up a set of terms that sound interchangeable to beginners, but actually mean very different things in real security programs. And those differences affect whether people can follow the rules and whether the organization can prove it is in control. When someone says policy, standard, guideline, baseline, or procedure casually, they may be pointing at the same general idea, which is expected behavior, but the purpose and level of detail behind each term is not the same. In a healthy environment, these documents fit together like parts of a single system, where each one has a job that the others cannot do well. When the terms are mixed up, you get predictable failure patterns, such as policies that are too technical to stay current, procedures that are too vague to be useful, and standards that nobody can enforce. The goal today is to give you crisp mental boundaries so you can tell what each item is for, how it should be written, and how it supports both adoption and evidence without turning security into a confusing paperwork maze. A practical way to begin is to see that all 5 terms exist because people need clarity at different altitudes, meaning different levels of abstraction. Some readers need a statement of intent and accountability, like leadership and auditors, while other readers need concrete details they can implement, like administrators and application owners. If you write everything at one altitude, it will either be too vague to drive action or too detailed to remain stable. This is why organizations separate the ideas instead of placing every expectation into one giant document. Another beginner trap is thinking the difference is mostly about length, as if a policy is long and a procedure is short, when the real difference is about purpose and how often the content should change. A policy is meant to be relatively stable, while a procedure may change whenever tools or workflows change. A standard is meant to define measurable requirements, while a guideline is meant to offer recommended practices when flexibility is needed. A baseline is meant to define a minimum secure configuration or state for a class of systems, and it sits between the abstract and the technical. Policies are the highest level commitments in this group, and it helps to think of a policy as the organization speaking with authority about what must be true and who is responsible for making it true. A security policy usually describes the objective, the scope of who and what it applies to, and the broad expectations that guide decisions, such as protecting sensitive data, controlling access, and responding to incidents. The policy should be stable enough to remain valid even as specific technologies change, which is why policies avoid tool names and configuration steps. Policies also define accountability, meaning who owns the program area and who has decision rights when trade-offs and exceptions appear. A policy that reads like a technical guide usually fails over time because technical details become outdated and then people stop trusting the document. A policy that is too vague also fails because it cannot be enforced or measured. The sweet spot is a policy that is clear about required outcomes and responsibilities, leaving the exact how to the documents that are supposed to evolve faster. Standards sit below policy, and they translate policy intent into specific, measurable requirements that can be implemented and verified. If a policy says access must be controlled, a standard might define what qualifies as controlled, such as requirements for authentication strength, review frequency, logging, and approval. Standards are where an organization can get precise without constantly rewriting the policy itself, because standards can be updated as threats and best practices evolve. A key feature of a standard is that it uses language that implies testability, meaning someone should be able to look at a system and determine whether it meets the standard. Standards are also where consistency is created across teams, because they define the minimum bar that everyone must meet for a given topic. Beginners sometimes confuse standards with baselines, but standards are the requirements, while baselines are often the concrete starting configurations that satisfy those requirements. Another misconception is that standards are optional like advice, when in a mature governance model, standards are mandatory unless an exception is approved. Standards are where enforcement becomes practical because they define compliance in observable terms. Guidelines are different because they are designed to provide recommended practices and decision support when strict requirements would be impractical or would cause unnecessary friction. A guideline says here is the preferred way to do something. Here are common pitfalls, and here are safer choices, but it allows teams to adapt based on context. This flexibility is valuable because not all systems have the same risk profile and not all constraints are the same, especially in cloud environments where architectures vary widely. A guideline can also serve as a bridge for beginners by explaining why a practice is recommended and what risk it reduces, which helps people make better decisions without feeling policed. The danger with guidelines is accidentally treating them like standards, which creates confusion because people cannot tell what is required versus what is suggested. The opposite danger is treating guidelines as useless, which wastes an opportunity to spread good habits and reduce mistakes in areas where rigid rules are not needed. Guidelines work best when they are clearly labeled as recommendations and when they point back to the relevant standards and policies so people understand the boundaries. In a healthy program, guidelines make compliance easier by offering good defaults and common solutions, not by adding extra obligations. Baselines often confuse beginners because the word sounds like a general concept, but in security governance, a baseline is typically a minimum secure configuration or minimum secure state for a system type or environment. A baseline might describe what settings should be enabled, what logging should be active, what access patterns are allowed, and what protections are assumed by default for a particular category, such as workstations, servers, storage, or identity systems. The baseline is not simply a wish list. It is the expected starting point for secure deployment, and it is meant to be repeatable. Baselines help scale security because they reduce decision fatigue, meaning teams do not have to invent security from scratch for every new system. They also help detect drift because you can compare current configuration to baseline expectations and quickly spot what changed. Baselines are often built to satisfy standards, which means a standard may say what must be true, while the baseline shows the default configuration that makes it true in practice. Beginners sometimes assume baselines are static forever, but baselines should evolve as threats and platform features change, though they should evolve in a controlled way so teams can adopt updates consistently. Procedures are where the rubber meets the road, because procedures describe the step-by-step way a task is performed within the organization's actual workflow. A procedure is typically written for someone who needs to do the work consistently, such as provisioning access, approving exceptions, responding to alerts, or handling data deletion requests. Procedures are intentionally specific, which means they change more frequently than policies and sometimes more frequently than standards, because tools, ownership, and workflows evolve. A procedure often answers questions like who does the task, what triggers it, what inputs are required, what approvals are needed, and how completion is recorded. This is also where evidence is generated, because procedures often produce artifacts like tickets, logs, approvals, and review records that show the work happened. Beginners sometimes confuse a procedure with a policy because both use directive language, but the difference is that a procedure is operational and detailed, while a policy is directional and stable. Another common failure is writing procedures that are vague or incomplete, which forces people to improvise, leading to inconsistent outcomes. Good procedures create reliability by making the correct steps easier to follow than ad hoc guessing. Now that the terms are defined, it helps to see how they connect as a system, because the system view prevents you from placing the wrong content in the wrong document. Policies set the intent and accountability. Standards define measurable requirements. Baselines define minimum secure configurations that satisfy those requirements. Guidelines provide recommended practices and judgment support, and procedures define the repeatable steps for carrying out the work. When these layers are aligned, each one reinforces the others without duplicating them. Policies stay stable and credible because they are not full of details that become obsolete. Standards remain enforceable because they are written in testable language rather than vague promises. Baselines remain actionable because they translate requirements into concrete defaults that can be deployed repeatedly. Guidelines remain helpful because they provide advice and examples without pretending to be mandatory rules. Procedures remain trusted because they match real workflows and generate consistent evidence. Beginners often struggle because organizations sometimes collapse these layers into one messy document, and then nobody knows what is required, what is optional, and what is merely historical. The system view is your antidote to that confusion because it tells you where each kind of information belongs. A useful way to make these distinctions stick is to walk through a simple example in your mind and watch how each document type, would contribute without stepping on the others. Imagine the organization wants to reduce the risk of unauthorized access to sensitive systems, which is a common security goal. The policy would state that access to sensitive systems must be controlled, that access must be granted based on business need, and that designated roles are responsible for approval and oversight. The standard would define what controlled means, such as requiring strong authentication, limiting privileged access, logging access events, and performing periodic reviews. The baseline would define the default configuration for systems and scope, such as which access mechanisms are enabled, what logging is turned on, and what default permissions exist at deployment. The guideline would offer recommended practices that help teams design safer access patterns, such as limiting broad group membership, using separate accounts for privileged work, and favoring automation that reduces manual errors. The procedure would describe exactly how an access request is submitted, reviewed, approved, implemented, verified, and recorded so the organization can demonstrate that the standard and policy are being carried out. One reason this taxonomy matters is that it prevents a classic beginner mistake, trying to solve governance problems with documentation alone while ignoring adoption and operations. A policy that declares strong security does nothing if there are no standards, baselines, and procedures to turn that declaration into reality. Likewise, a set of technical procedures can be perfectly written and still fail if there is no policy backing them and no standard defining the minimum acceptable outcome. The layers also help resolve conflicts because they clarify what can change easily and what should change slowly. If a technical workflow changes, you update a procedure, not the policy, which keeps leadership expectations stable while operations evolve. If a new threat emerges, you may update a standard and then update baselines that implement the standard, without rewriting the policy every month. If teams need flexibility in how they design a solution, guidelines can provide recommended options while still respecting mandatory requirements. Without these separations, every change becomes an argument about rewriting a foundational document, and governance becomes brittle. Clear distinctions make the program resilient because it can adapt without losing its identity. Another common misunderstanding is thinking that the most detailed document is automatically the most important, which leads some teams to overinvest in procedures while neglecting standards and baselines. Procedures are crucial, but if you only have procedures, you end up with local correctness rather than organization-wide consistency. One team might have strong access procedures, while another team improvises, and without standards and baselines, there is no consistent bar to compare them. The reverse misunderstanding is thinking policies are all that matter, which leads to broad statements that sound good but do not create measurable control. A mature program uses each document type for its proper job, and it also ensures that each document points to the others so readers can follow the chain from intent to implementation. That chain is what auditors and leaders often look for, because it shows that the organization is not only saying the right things, but also operating them consistently. When the chain is missing, audits become stressful because the organization scrambles to prove that high-level statements have real operational support. When the chain is present, evidence emerges naturally because procedures and baselines create consistent artifacts. You also need to understand how these documents behave over time, because document lifecycle is where many programs quietly degrade. Policies should change slowly, typically when strategy, scope, or accountability changes. Standards should change when the minimum bar needs to move, such as when outdated security practices are no longer acceptable or when new protections become necessary. Baselines should change when platforms evolve and when secure defaults must be updated to match modern expectations, but they should change in a controlled way so teams can absorb updates without chaos. Guidelines should evolve as recommended practices improve and as lessons are learned from incidents and near misses. Procedures should evolve most frequently because they are tied to real workflows, and workflows change as systems, teams, and responsibilities change. When an organization treats all documents as static, drift occurs because reality moves while expectations stay frozen on paper. When an organization changes everything too frequently, people stop trusting the documents because they feel unstable. The balance is controlled evolution where each layer changes at an appropriate pace, supported by review cadences and ownership. This lifecycle thinking is part of distinguishing the terms, because the expected rate of change is a clue about what belongs in which document. In cloud environments, these distinctions become even more important because speed and flexibility increase the risk of inconsistent decisions and configuration drift. Teams can create new resources quickly, copy configurations from other projects, and adjust permissions to solve urgent problems, which means baselines and standards must be clear enough to guide fast work. A baseline that provides a secure starting point reduces the temptation to invent one-off settings under pressure. Standards that define non-negotiable expectations reduce the risk that convenience will silently weaken protection. Procedures that describe how to request changes and handle exceptions prevent emergency fixes from becoming permanent loopholes. Guidelines can help teams design safer architectures without forcing every team into a rigid template that does not fit their use case. Policies remain important because cloud responsibility is shared, and the organization must define who is accountable for ensuring the shared responsibilities are met. Beginners sometimes think the cloud provider handles governance, but governance is still the customer's job, and document clarity is one way to scale that job across many teams. The clearer the taxonomy, the less likely teams are to confuse advice with requirement or requirement with optional preference. As we wrap up, the main value of distinguishing policies, standards, guidelines, baselines, and procedures is that it creates a governance system that people can actually use, maintain, and prove. Policies express stable intent and accountability, telling the organization what must be true and who owns ensuring it. Standards translate that intent into testable requirements that define what compliance looks like in observable terms. Guidelines provide recommended practices and decision support, helping teams make safer choices when flexibility is needed and when strict rules would be counterproductive. Baselines define minimum secure configurations or states that implement standards consistently at scale and make drift detectable. Procedures describe the repeatable operational steps that make the system real, producing evidence through consistent execution and record-keeping. When you keep these layers distinct, you reduce confusion, improve adoption, make audits calmer, and create security outcomes that hold up over time.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.